The way back to Dalia. The morning train hummed softly as it curved along the coastline, the glass windows catching the slow shimmer of sunlight spilling over the sea. Elias sat by the window, his reflection blending with the pale blue of the sky. Dalia was still 2 stops away, but he already felt the weight of the years settle in his chest. He hadn't been back in more than 20 years. The town had lived in his mind all this time as something delicate, suspended in salt air and memory, untouchable by time. He wondered if it still smelled of baked bread and the faint sweetness of seaweed drying on the shore. He wondered if Mara still lived there. The train slowed, the brakes sighing like an old man's breath, and for a moment Elias closed his eyes. He saw her at 18, standing barefoot on the sand, wind in her hair, a seashell pressed to her ear as though listening for secrets the ocean kept just for her. He smiled without meaning to, the kind of smile that carries both warmth and ache. When he stepped off the train, Dalia was exactly as he remembered, almost. The little shops still leaned into one another along the main street. The bakery's blue sign had faded, and the bookstore's bell still chimed when the door opened. But there were new things too, a cafe where the old hardware store used to be, painted bright yellow, and children with phones instead of kites. The sea smelled the same though, and the gulls still circled above like the town's restless spirits. He walked slowly, letting the air wrap around him, letting it tell him that some things had changed, but not everything. He found the house easily, though he'd told himself he might not. The white gate still squeaked, the bougainvillea had grown wilder, and the small wooden swing in the yard was gone. He almost turned away, unsure if he had the right to knock, unsure if nostalgia counted as reason enough. But before he could decide, the front door opened. Mara stood there, holding a watering can, her hair now threaded with silver, her eyes the same color as the sea at dusk. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She put the can down slowly, her hands trembling just slightly. "Elias," she said, and his name on her tongue felt like something he had been missing without realizing it. They talked the way people do when trying to catch up with decades in minutes. He told her about the city, about his work designing buildings that looked out over rivers but never seas. She told him she'd stayed, teaching art at the local school, painting sunsets she never sold because she couldn't bear to part with them. The conversation stumbled at first, then softened. It became easy again, familiar in the way of old rhythms remembered by the body. She poured them tea, and he noticed her hand still curved around the cup the same way they did when she was young, as though warming her palms could coax words from the steam. They walked later to the shore. The tide was low, and the wet sand shimmered like glass. Children ran past them, their laughter skipping across the water. Elias looked at Mara, her dress brushing against the wind, and thought she looked exactly as she had the last night he'd seen her, standing beneath the pier lights, eyes bright with a kind of hope that made promises without words. Back then, he had told her he would come back. He had meant it, every syllable. But life, as it often does, turned quietly away from intention. Letters grew fewer, work grew heavier, and by the time he could have returned, it had felt too late. He had built a life elsewhere, one with comfort and quiet companionship, but a small part of his heart had stayed here, like a note left unplayed. They sat on a driftwood log, the same one, she told him, that storms hadn't carried away. "You know," she said, smiling faintly, "I used to think about you every time the tide changed. I'd tell myself maybe this was the one that would bring you back." Her words were not bitter, just matter-of-fact, soft and even. Elias looked at the horizon where the sky met the sea and felt the years press gently against him. "I used to think the same," he said quietly. "Every time it rained, I wondered if it was raining here too." She laughed then, a quiet sound, full of both amusement and disbelief. "So we were still connected by weather," she said. "That's something." They spent the afternoon walking through Dalia's narrow streets, stopping by the old cafe where the owner still remembered their names. The coffee was stronger than he recalled, and the pastries smaller, but the laughter came easily. They talked about everything and nothing, the friends who had moved away, the songs that had once played endlessly on cassette radios, the night the town lost power and they danced under candlelight in the town hall. The conversation meandered like the tide, drawing close and pulling back, gentle and forgiving. When the sun began to fall, they walked back toward the pier. The air had turned golden, and the water mirrored the sky in streaks of orange and rose. "Do you ever wish," Elias asked, "that things had been different?" Mara took her time before answering. "Sometimes," she said. "But then I think, if they had been, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here now, grateful in ways we couldn't have been then." Her eyes caught the last light of the day, and for a moment, she looked ageless, eternal, the way some memories refuse to fade. They sat in silence as dusk gathered around them. Elias thought of all the years he'd spent imagining this place, this moment. He realized now that it wasn't about regret or longing, it was about acknowledgement. The kind of love they had wasn't meant to last forever in the ordinary sense. It was meant to remind them that once, in some brief stretch of their lives, they had found something pure. He turned to her and said softly, "You were the best part of who I was." She smiled, eyes glistening. "And you," she said, "were the proof that I could love and let go without breaking." The first stars began to appear, faint and tremulous above the sea. Mara stood and brushed sand from her hands. "You'll miss your train if you don't leave soon," she said. "You always were bad with schedules." He rose, smiling. "Some things never change." They walked together back to the main road. At her gate, they paused. "Thank you," he said simply. "For today." She nodded. "For coming back," she replied. Her voice was gentle but steady. He hesitated, wanting to say more, but found that words would only dilute what was already understood. She reached out, touched his hand lightly, and then turned to go inside. Elias walked to the station under a sky filled with constellations he used to name for her. The train arrived with a soft rush of wind, and as he boarded, he looked out the window. Through the blur of motion, he saw her silhouette at the gate, motionless, watching. He raised his hand instinctively, though he wasn't sure she could see. When the train began to move, Dalia slipped slowly from view, the roofs, the waves, the narrow roads, all folding back into memory. On the ride home, he felt neither sorrow nor joy, but a kind of peace that had taken years to ripen. He realized that returning had not been about rekindling anything, it had been about understanding what had once been real and allowing it to rest. Some loves are not meant to be lived forever, they are meant to be carried, like a scent, faint but unforgotten. The train traced the curve of the coast once more, the sea glimmering under moonlight, and he thought that perhaps love, in its truest form, does not end, it simply changes its shape, becoming quieter, kinder, and infinite in the spaces where memory meets forgiveness. Mara stood by the window that night, watching the lights fade in the distance until they were swallowed by the dark. She did not cry. She made tea and sat by her easel, the half-finished painting of a shoreline waiting patiently. She dipped her brush in pale gold and drew the outline of a man walking away along the sand. She smiled, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Some people return to remind you that what you had was real. Some people never truly leave, even when they do. The tide whispered against the shore, repeating its endless story. Dalia slept under a blanket of quiet waves, holding its memories close. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a train moved steadily toward the dawn, carrying a man who finally understood that love is not always about holding on, it is often about finding the grace to let a beautiful thing stay beautiful in its own time.